Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Global Guardian. The Taiwan question: where are we now and what lies ahead? Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's panelists by typing your questions into the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording and the slides in a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Global Guardian Chief Operating Officer, Mark Post. Mark?
Thank you, Shannon, and welcome to today's latest Global Guardian webinar. The topic today is China and Taiwan, what lies ahead? As tensions mount, the Taiwan question looms large in boardrooms across the globe. We will discuss where things stand on this brewing issue and also provide a snapshot of Global Guardian's new Taiwan Shock Index, which was released yesterday. Next slide, please. For those of you who may not be familiar with Global Guardian, we are a global security and medical support response firm based just outside of Washington, D.C., with offices in Charlotte, North Carolina, and London. We pride ourselves in having built a network of vetted, trained, and tested local response teams in over 130 countries around the world. Next slide, please. Our first panelist today is Dale Buckner, President and CEO of Global Guardian. Dale has led Global Guardian since inception in 2012. He's a decorated combat commander with multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, Haiti, and Cuba. Dale served in the United States Army Infantry for 9 years, in military intelligence for 2 years, and in Special Forces Green Berets. Dale has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and business and master's degrees in public administration and business administration. Our second panelist is Zev Feintuch, Senior Intelligence Analyst in Global Guardian's Intelligence Division. Zev is a lead analyst on geopolitics and expert on China, Russia, Iran, and the Middle East. He plays a key role at Global Guardian in supporting clients with crisis planning and response. Zev is also responsible for many of the Global Guardian's intelligence products, including the Risk Barometer and the annual Worldwide Threat Assessment and Risk Map. Our third presenter is John O'Connor. John is a Global Guardian Advisory Board member. He served as chairman of J.H. Whitney Investments Management since January 2005. From January 2009 through March 2011, he served as CEO of Tektronix Holdings, a Whitney Capital Partners portfolio holding company that provided tactical integrated electronic systems and composite armor solutions to U.S. and foreign military customers. Previously, John was chairman of J.P. Morgan Alternative Asset Management and an executive partner of J.P. Morgan Partners. He was also a member of the Risk Management Committee of J.P. Morgan Chase. John earned a BA in economics from Tulane University and an MBA from Columbia University Graduate School of Business. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Dale.
Thanks, Mark. I just have 4 quick slides to open up the webinar today. First being, we're titling this scorecard. So as you look at this, a year ago, we put out these 4 bullets. In full transparency, after the webinar, I received a lot of texts, a lot of emails, and a lot of phone calls from several CSOs in the Fortune 1000 and several family offices saying, Dale, we think you're being aggressive. We think your intel and your predictions are aggressive. What I would say is a lot has changed in a year. We think that we are on the right path, and we do want to be aggressive with these predictions that we have, and we will not always be right. In this case, we think we've got a good track record going into the audience and to our client base. And looking back, we really do think this was the right tone. As you're looking at what's happening in the world, we didn't want to lose the bubble on China. There's a lot going on in the Middle East. There's a lot of things going on domestically. Economically, there's a lot of distraction. The reason we followed up on this webinar was we just didn't want to lose this, and that we think there's a lot going on here and everyone really needs to pay attention to this space. Next slide. As you look at this, if you caught the 60 Minutes with Director Wray of the FBI and Five Eyes this past Sunday, or you look at these quotes, the first one being from the DNI, the second being from SecDef, we really do think just in the last year, there's been a material pivot in the US government to China, and they're now taking this much more seriously. And the predictions are much more aggressive than they were a year ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. This really has become top of mind, and the bureaucracies are moving towards it. Next slide. And then lastly, before I hand off to Zev, as you look from left to right here, at the bottom, the posture review, if you will, again, really indicates that the US government is now taking this much more seriously than it was a year ago. And I think that will continue. In the middle, I think corporate America has now realized this is real, it is happening, and it is a direct threat. And corporate America is now taking this in a much more serious fashion. And then lastly, on the right, this is just to give you a snapshot of what's happening. If you're not familiar, the DPP is a bit of they're looking for a status quo or outright independence of Taiwan, and they are leading in the polls. So there's about a 55% indication that they will win the election, and that they're looking for either a separatist or status quo of the current situation. So we don't think on the island itself, you're going to see a material change where the mainland comes in and changes what's happening with the populace and wanting to reunify. Next slide. Zev?
Thanks, Dale. So the Taiwan question, right? We already know the who, China, Taiwan. So today I'm going to be talking about the what, the when, the why, the how, and then the so what. So I'm sure some of you on this call are familiar with the idea of one country, two systems. This was applied to Hong Kong after the British handover in '97. But the whole idea of being able to ostensibly be under one country, but be able to maintain, democratic norms and a separate legal system, the whole idea was there to help coax Taiwan into peacefully rejoining China. However, following the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, the prospects of a peaceful reunification of Taiwan with the mainland appear pretty dim. As Dale just alluded to, popular opinion is not for reunifying with China. And, we all know what happened in 2020 to Hong Kong. So someone much smarter than myself once said this, but China is a civilization pretending to be a nation state. And Taiwan is part of that cynic civilization, right? In '49, during the Civil War in China, one of the factions made it out to Taiwan, but they're Chinese. And naturally, this was, very, very hurtful for the body politique and for the self-image of the Chinese civilization, so to speak. So 1839 through 1949, China looks at it as the century of humiliation. And the goal now is for this next 100 years, ending in 1949, to reverse the trend and to enact what she calls a national rejuvenation, where China can, proudly raise its head and be the dominant player in the world. So enter Xi. So Xi Jinping is by far now the most powerful leader in CCP history. He's eliminated checks and balances. He's eliminated and any kind of bars on ideology, term limits, and more importantly, he's really eliminated dissent within the CCP. And as we look on the news, there's key defense and other important officials, that just go missing. With a key member just last week. So essentially, at this point, Xi's will has now become China's national interest. So this is where the personal and political rationales for a reunification with Taiwan kind of get merged into one here. So the key thing, as I mentioned here before, is that there's really no dissent. So if we look at what happened last year with Russia's illegal invasion on Ukraine, part of the reason why that happened is because President Putin was, made this decision in a very small group of people, and he received bad intel, bad advice. The situation in China is a lot worse, and there's very little folks in the CCP and the defense community who can say anything that contradicts what's on Xi's mind. So he's surrounded by yes men, can be fed with bad intel, and Xi's 70 right now. And if you look at Mao's legacy, right, he's the father of modern China. Deng was responsible for Nixon and the opening of China, and then their economic miracle, which I'll touch on subsequently. But right now, really, the BRI Belt and Road Initiative hasn't been too successful, and really, she needs some sort of major victory under its belt. And if you look at his speeches, and if you look at the way the party is oriented, and just how central reunification is to the legitimacy of the party, the legacy of Xi is going to be the reunification of Taiwan. Now, for the interest of time, don't really have time to go over the strategic ramifications here, but real quick, um, China retaking Taiwan would completely disrupt the U.S. Security architecture in the region. Taiwan's part of the first island chain, which also includes Japan and parts of the Philippines. As soon as China's Navy can kind of break out of that, there's really nothing containing them. And this could really allow China to bully its neighbors in East Asia, namely Japan, South Korea, and use that to leverage their geoeconomic interest. And also losing Taiwan would completely discredit the U.S. security guarantee for its allies abroad, and might encourage further erosion of America's broader power. Might get time to touch on some of these later. Next slide, please. Great. So you might be familiar with the Thucydides trap, propagated by Graham Allison over at Harvard. Over here, gonna give you a little overview of a little bit more, nuanced version of this pattern that we've seen. So over the last 150 years, great powers that have peaked become a lot more aggressive after they slow down. So some examples of this, the best example really would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. We can look at pre-World War I Germany, Japan before World War II. So essentially, here's how this pattern goes. The country experiences a rapid rise, right? The greatest economic miracle on earth, China. People get richer, the country gets a little bit more confident. That inspires the other countries in the region to form a countervailing system to try to contain this country. We saw the creation of AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, which is a defense pact. Japan has changed its constitution, started to remilitarize. In fact, Asia now is, for the last 5 years, has had the most defense spending increases on the globe. We also now have the Quad. So importantly here, we've already hit peak China. Already in 2015, the working population peaked. And if you look at their productivity growth, it's been declining. Their GDP growth is no longer in double digits. And COVID really, really put a damper on the economic prospects in China. And one could even argue that they're coming close to hitting stagnation, which brings us to the next step in this all too familiar pattern. So at this point, right, China's neighbors, and as Dale mentioned, the United States has really woken up to this threat of a rising China. And now the rivals have grown a lot stronger. In fact, China's biggest trade partner, the European Union, now considers it to be a systemic rival after many years of enmity between South Korea and Japan because of World War II. For the first time ever, they're shaking hands, and just did a military exercise just last week. So now essentially this countervailing system has really become inculcated, and we're now taking this threat very seriously. So essentially, we're now in a situation where China's window of opportunity is starting to close. They've already peaked. They're now starting to decline. And what happens is that you come to a point where, as a great and proud nation, it's much better to be humiliated on the battlefield than for your country to be in open decline. So this fear of decline actually engenders this now or never attitude, and we're rapidly approaching that. Next slide, please. So really quick, so here we have a probability distribution along with a timeline. So now we're in 2024. Underneath the distribution, we have a timeline of events. We'll call out some of these important events here. So right now, as you can see, we're very close getting to that middle of distribution when we think that China might make its move. So some important events here are the presidential election in Taiwan, which Dale talked about a little bit before. They could get another anti-China candidate. But in addition to that, we have the U.S. presidential transition. There's going to be an election in a year from now and a period of a few months, in which case, if the incumbent President Biden doesn't get reelected, there could be a lot of chaos when the administrations switch over their people. Taiwan's military has said that China is going to be militarily ready to invade by 2025. And then in 2027, we have the centennial of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, their centennial. Now, as we move down in time to the right over here, I'd like to highlight that in 2030, this is when we think, subject to many different things, but that the U.S. is going to get close to achieving semiconductor sovereignty. We might get into this later, but essentially Taiwan is the world's chip manufacturing factory. 90% of all the most advanced chips that we use for everything high tech is produced there. So essentially, we believe that there's a 60% chance of a limited conflict. I'm going to outline that in the next slide. A 35% chance that we actually get a full-on invasion, and a 5% chance that diplomacy, that there'll be a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan question. Next slide, please. So here's what we're looking for, and here's what you should be looking for in terms of warning signs for when something might happen. So if there's a perception of U.S. weakness and or distraction, that could come during the presidential transition. Who knows what's going to happen with the Middle East right now? Another key thing is in terms of actually successfully conducting an amphibious landing. May to July and then October are the times when the sea in the Taiwan Strait's the lowest and most conducive to sending over nearly 1 million people without having the sea complicate that. Xi's health, of course, and a perception of Taiwan's readiness, as well as how, again, going back to the U.S. being distracted, how stretched is the U.S. and what's their capacity to help out Taiwan. I'll let you read the triggers, but the big one here is provocative steps. We saw what happened when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan last time, and these triggers are also coincide with the considerations on the left in terms of Taiwan's readiness. So essentially, what do we think the most likely scenario is going to look like here? Apologies. China operates in the gray zone. What's the gray zone? That's essentially taking actions that fall short of eliciting some kind of conflict. We need to look no further than the little green men in 2014 in Russia, what Iran does, and what China's quite frankly doing right now with Taiwan's airspace. If you look at their legal assertions, their military posture, it looks like they are going to try to slowly, and also the strategic posture review also highlighted this, but slowly institute some type of blockade, and try to then get Taiwan or the United States or someone else to actually fire the first shot, or slowly, creepily take over, and with the threat of force, ideally for them, peacefully take over China, take over Taiwan very slowly. Next slide, please. But what would this look like for the rest of the world? So over here, we have Global Guardian's 2024 Taiwan Shock Index. It's part of our risk map that we just released today. Don't have much time to explain this right now, but I highly recommend you go to our website. It's an interactive map and also features some deep dives into different sectors that could be impacted by an invasion. But essentially, this map over here tries to explain what would happen to the rest of the world if a Taiwan Strait crisis occurs. If you look at the colors going from low and light blue up to dark red as extreme, these ratings indicate the degree to which a Taiwan Strait crisis could destabilize a given country. This isn't the current risk map. This is how countries might be destabilized by a conflict over Taiwan. As you can see, a lot of the map is red, medium risk. That's a reflection of our forecast on what might happen, mostly to the global south. This map's a combination of, on one hand, how stable a country is currently, and on the other hand, how exposed those other countries are to China. We're talking bilateral trade and investment. We're talking about Chinese help in countries maintaining their own stability, repressive means, so surveillance technology, the middle boxes to cut out cell phone reception, internet in the face of a crisis. But as you can see over here, and Pakistan is by far and large the most exposed to China and currently unstable. And we highly advise you to take a look at this map. But without any further ado, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, John. Thank you.
Zev, thank you very much. Dale, Mark, thank you as well. And thank you to the folks who are here with us today. I appreciate you taking time. I'm going to take a very quick spin through who we are and how we advance Zev's great work and partnership. As to who we are, J.H. Whitney Investment Management, we're one of the longest standing venture capital companies in the United States, having going back to 1947. And at our heart, we are business analysts, investment analysts, and national or geopolitical security analysts. And we have three distinct lines of business. We are a defense contractor where our specialty is advising the Defense Department and the intelligence community on economic competition and technology competition. As I mentioned, we're also investors. We invest in mid to late stage venture companies in the technology families, supporting national security and intelligence. And lastly, and most recently, we've entered the data and analytics world, really at the behest of our government clients who said, look, we need objective and quantitative measures to define risk, and risk as both the probability of the occurrence of an event and the impact should that event occur. And go back, please, Shannon. We rely on some very critical partnerships and some information partners. We look to the commercial risk management market, Willis Towers Watson, the Hartford, and others, because we believe the commercial geopolitical risk pricing, the property casualty risk pricing, shipping risk pricing is among the most objective indicators of trends in geopolitical risk. We're also very involved in academia. Personally, I am on faculty at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point as a senior fellow where I lecture in the economics of national security and defense. I've also been a lecturer at Texas A&M, and most recently, I'm a fellow with the Purdue Kroc Institute of Great Power Politics and Strategic Competition and Technology. And then finally, as I mentioned, we are vendors to and partners with many elements of the US government in the economic and technology field. Next, please. Shannon, next slide. So this is a recap that I recently delivered at the National Defense Industries Association, and really to try to simplify where are the theaters of competition in this overarching world, competitive world particularly with the PRC. And we break that down into three major theaters of competition. And for the benefit of our military customers, as Dale and Mark will attest, nothing communicates to the military like a stoplight chart and a trend arrow. It just gives you the direction and the status. And so really the first theater of competition is the global trade ecosystem. And if you look back in time, the top of the left first bar is where we were 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, the US was the center of gravity in a trade network, along with Germany and to a lesser degree, France. But we were the clear center of gravity. And as a consequence, because of being that trade center of gravity, from that flowed naturally a whole bunch of influence having to do with everything from financial flows to technology standards to actually where things get manufactured. If you fast forward the tape 30 years, by 2020, and you do the diagram of countries connected to their primary trading partner, Germany had eclipsed France, and was still a center of gravity in a Eurocentric trade network. But the US had fallen from a primary center of gravity to an increasingly secondary center of gravity within what is best described as a China ecosystem of global trade. And this has profound implications because where we trade also dictates where we manufacture and who sets the standards of trade terms and technology terms. And that brings us to the second theater of competition. The Chinese introduced in 2015 a plan called Made in China 2025, which was their stated desire to lead the world in 10 critical technologies, which will shape the global world for decades to come. The US didn't really respond until most recently 2021, when the Defense Department determined 14 critical technologies and the White House determined 12 critical technologies. And so the competitive framework and the race is now defined between the US and the PRC for global leadership in these 10 to 15 critical technologies. This Venn diagram describes how MITRE, which is one of the federally funded research labs, characterizes the state of the competitive balance today, with the US leading in 6 technologies, the Chinese leading in 3 technologies, and it's a jump ball in some of the critical 4 technologies, which would include artificial intelligence, next generation networks, which would include 6G, 5G, NG, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing. And this is really why Taiwan is important, because both of us developed a critical dependency on Taiwan in the form of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and the ecosystem on the island that supports them. And both of us are now determined to mitigate that dependency by developing our own indigenous semiconductor manufacturing. That all by itself is very highly destabilizing. And then the third theater of competition is global capital markets. And that really breaks down into investment and trade as well. Interestingly, the Chinese RMB has now surpassed the dollar in trade settlements very quietly. I mean, it's by no means approaching a reserve currency per se, but they have made very substantial strides in getting trade partners to denominate trade in RMB. Most importantly, with certain Middle Eastern countries who will now accept renminbi as payment for oil, as opposed to having to go through the dollar. All of these are very important, and this is how we characterize the current economic competition. Next slide, please. We got here really because China chose to initiate a competitive strategy in the economic domain, really because they have no desire to fight the US militarily. It would be incredibly disruptive and bloody. And true to their own doctrine, they would much rather win without fighting than win by having to go to a military conflict. And back in 2015, alongside the Made in China 2025 program, they began to initiate a whole series of laws, all of which fall under the general category of civil-military fusion, which basically means that they want to have absolute control of their domestic market and any competitor in that domestic market, and while at the same time being a very aggressive exporter. And so all of these policies, and that's the best thing about analyzing China, is they write down everything, they publish it, and then they actually execute off of it. It's tedious, but by tracking what they say, you will learn what they do. And if you want to understand China, you just read Xi, and you will understand that he is firmly committed to Marxist-Leninist principles and is in the process of executing a societal design plan consistent with Marxist-Leninist principles, and that uses the economy as a vehicle through which to affect societal change and to project power on the global stage. We can come back to this later in questions and answers, but I wanted to lay the groundwork with this. Next slide, please. The US was late to respond because there was a firm belief in the successive administrations that the rise of China could become a benign and beneficial phenomenon, and that they would in time embrace global norms of trade and economic relations and become a consistent actor on the world stage. However, by 2018, in the Trump administration, it began to be clear that that was unlikely to occur. And so Doctrine 118 from the Defense Department really kind of made policy what had been stated in the national security strategy, that we are now operating in an environment of great power politics and strategic competition. And this is the first time we made that official statement since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So we have retraced 35 years back into a new global operating environment. And all the lessons learned after 20 years of conflict in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, are essentially worthless, and that we have to go back to great power training. And so gradually that began to accelerate in policy and doctrinal matters. We published a strategic approach in 2020, an Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022, the national security strategy reinforced and reemphasized. The 2022 report on military and security developments was very grim. I will point out that the 2023 report just got published last week and actually is consistent, shall I say, with Zeb's gray zone embargo is clearly one of the potential scenarios. And then in 2023, the Joint Chiefs Staff published the Joint Concept for Competing, where it called out for the first time that we are in this competition. The prospects for off-ramps out of this competition are limited, that the PRC is distinctly no longer just a competitor, but an adversary, and that in order to prevail in this conflict, it will require more than a whole of government effort. It will require a whole of society effort, and it will require the active partnership and participation of the private sector. Next strategy, please. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, we were asked to develop tools that began to help risk managers in the Defense Department, in the intelligence community, and now in the commercial world, understand both where they stand on a relative basis in terms of entanglement with the BRC, and how they, as a guideline to how they might mitigate it. And as an example here, this is what we call our geostrategic risk rating. This is a 10-factor model which breaks into 3 categories of governance, commercial risk, and operational risk. And all of the data that's utilized in this model is taken from company-sourced regulatory reporting. So our degree of confidence in the validity and verifiability of this data is very, very high. So this comes from companies' SEC reporting or analogous reporting in foreign countries, patent filings, and other regulatory reporting. We also use our proprietary insights in knowledge of how the government thinks about these risk factors. And what we then do is seek to quantify on an absolute and relative basis. And interestingly, at the end of last quarter, we identified Apple as a company that had the equivalent of what we would call below investment grade risk. This scale goes from is bowling, not golf. So a higher score is better than a lower score. And so what we find generally is that a score of 2.2 or 2.3 would be the dividing line between acceptable risk and risks of concern. And we began to, when we looked at Apple, it was quite surprising because it still is the largest company in the world by market capitalization. But as we peeled it back, we realized, okay, quite simply, 20% roughly of their global revenue comes from China. They're highly entangled through joint ventures and strategic alliances, which entangle both their software processes as well as their hardware manufacturing processes. And a lot of this is opaque at the surface, but can be illuminated through a detailed examination of their reporting. This came to the forefront a couple of weeks ago when you will have seen that China announced that Chinese government officials will no longer be able to utilize Apple iPhones, that they have become prohibited. Now, what's interesting is I don't know the exact count of the number of Chinese government officials, but I think the important thing is to extrapolate from that based on the knowledge of what is called the social credit scoring system in China, that every individual citizen has a social credit score, and that social credit score indicates each individual's degree of harmony with the Xi Jinping Marxist-Leninist vision. And it would not be unreasonable to expect that ownership of a foreign manufactured phone would be seen as being disloyal. And this announcement was very carefully timed to coincide with the announcement by Huawei of their new high-performance smartphone, which was a lower-cost competitor to the iPhone. So there was both a hurt Apple and help Huawei element to this. And we find it extremely illuminating and indicative of future moves against US and Western companies. Next slide, please. And so what we show in this slide, and I could go on much deeper about this, is this represents the broadest base index we can find, which is the Selective. Selective is essentially a direct competitor of Morgan Stanley Capital International. And this is an index comprised of roughly 1,600 global companies all of which have a market capitalization greater than $5 billion US, all of whom we have rated. And so this is the number of companies, not their capitalization, but the number of companies rated as to their geostrategic risk rating. And what it shows us is that over 50% of the global, 1,600 have relatively high degrees of risk arising from entanglement in the PRC. So that should there be a sudden, sharp decoupling, it could impinge on their resilience in the worst case, and in any case, would more likely than not be material on their profitability. And this makes sense to us in the context of that stoplight chart slide I showed you about how large the China global trade network has got. It's a very big factor. So if you go to the next slide, this has now become front of mind in the boardroom. We are getting inbound requests from a lot of boards of directors that says, in the aftermath of Russia, Ukraine, and with a greater understanding of the potential for a sharp decoupling from China, we must have a risk management strategy within our enterprise risk management system that helps us both illuminate our risk, measure our risk, and come up with mitigation plans of our risk. And that's one of the things we're working with at the Kroc Institute is a handbook for boards of directors on how to think about the process of risk assessment having to do with geostrategic risk. Similarly, the same phenomena is happening in investment committees of institutional investors. So whether you're a retirement system, a foundation, an endowment, a 401k management company, given what happened in the aftermath of Ukraine and Russia, all fiduciaries are having to begin to think about how do we characterize this. And then technology companies particularly have an obligation to drill deep into your strategy in the context of your supply chain and your value chain. And so far, mainstream investment research has not answered the mail on this. Illustrated here is, Goldman Sachs in the bottom left-hand corner, the Carnegie Institute in the upper right-hand corner. Everybody's grappling with this, but we at Whitney are the first ones to take it down to an individual company level. And so we're happy to answer questions about it. We're happy to go offline with you all on it. We do have a service to this effect that we can help you through. But Dale, Mark, Zev, thanks for the opportunity to work with you today. Dale, I'll turn it back over to you for a wrap up, and then we can move forward.
Thank you. So we just have 3 quick slides. We'll get to Q&A. Next slide, please. As you look at this, one, you've heard me say this a lot. Just this is basic blocking, tackling for all those CSOs, HR directors, people are in charge of people in mainland China and or the region in Taiwan. One, it's an island. If you think of the last 3 big crises, in Afghanistan, we could get people out to Pakistan by ground, knowing the air option was a mess. In Ukraine, we could get people to Poland. We could get them to Romania. We could get them out initially by air, and then that window closed. Now in Israel, there's still air options. There's still air charters. We can take people to Jordan, and there is a sea option. In Taiwan, the assumption is if you don't get out early, that there is no option. There might be a window of 24 to 48 hours by sea to the Philippines. We think that's real, but that will dry up quickly. This is different. It's much, much harder. Ultimately, the bottom bullet here is number 4. Preemptive planning is critical now. If you're assuming that because you track your people, you have an alert system, and you have a medical evacuation provider, you're somehow ready for Taiwan and conflict in the region, we just think it's just a fallacy. And as you look at the bottom right here with your typical crisis management resiliency planning, the word that's not in that that little chart is execution. You see a lot of preemptive planning. You think about triggers, you think about what you're going to do. Ultimately, the only way this plays well is if you have an actual execution plan that you can operate off that's real and don't assume away all the complexities of the region. Next slide. As you think through that, this is the way we think about how you should be thinking about your company and protecting its employees and assets. One on the far left under assets, when you think about when Russia went into Ukraine, there were a lot of companies surprised by that. There was a lot of people that lost assets and had money stuck in Russia to this day. You can avoid this by pre-planning now and having financial access to your capital outside of mainland China and or Taiwan. You want to think about that now. When you think about the middle bucket of people, are there expats that can be replaced over the next year or so you don't have expats in that exposure? Can you think about that? Do you have a real evacuation plan with real triggers? We showed you triggers today. We think you should be planning off of those now. And this is the biggest guidance. As you look at Israel over the last few weeks, think about how long this first State Department aircraft charter out was 8 days into the conflict. We would tell you, you're not going to have 8 days if this gets set off. You might have a day or two of air. The aviation option in Israel today is a massive luxury. We've been lucky to have it. We predicted we would lose it early. We didn't. It's a luxury. I don't believe in any scenario of gaming of this situation. You will have that situation if this happens with Taiwan. And then lastly, as you think to the far right, when you think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning, can you move assets, people out of Taiwan, out of mainland China now over the next few years? And are you ready for the inevitable? If we start to lose that supply chain or start to lose access to that market in the short term, medium term, and then long term, you lose it completely. Are you thinking in those terms? These are things that we're asking you to ask your own organization internally right now. So that's all we have. Next slide, and I'll finish up and we'll get to Q&A. Ultimately, this slide, all of you are tracking this. Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, non-state actors. We're all living it every day. As you look at this, ultimately, that last bullet, currently the United States, the European Union, and the Chinese privacy laws are incompatible. We are decoupling. It's real. The US government in the West is now taking this much more seriously and getting ready for it. When you combine that with all of the other friction points we have around the world, don't lose sight of this space. We know you're probably distracted with economic situation, what's going on in the Middle East right now, what's happening with Russia continues. Don't lose this space because it can have material effects on your business, your people, your infrastructure. I'll pause there, Mark, and go to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions. And if those that have to leave at the top of the hour need to leave, this is recorded and it will be on the website, the Global Guardian website to go back to. So, John, let me direct the first question to you. What would happen to the semiconductor industry should China implement a blockade on Taiwan?
Mark, thank you. 56% of the high-end semiconductors the world depends on are produced in Taiwan. So it is generally estimated that TSMC and its ecosystem would begin to wind down in a matter of days and weeks in the face of economic sanctions that would be imposed after such a soft or hard invasion. And then you would begin to have the cascading second and third order effects of the loss of access to high-end semiconductors. And that impact has been generally estimated by a number of sources from Carnegie Institute, Nikkei, Asia, and others as someplace between 7 and 10% of global GDP, or something materially in excess of the impact of the global financial crisis, and perhaps as large or more as the 1929 market crash and subsequent depression. So it's regrettable, but we as a world, not just a country, kind of violated all risk management principles and allowed a single point of failure with material negative consequences to develop in the system.
Thank you. Zev, I'll direct this one at you. What other industries do you think will be hit hardest in the short run from a Taiwan Strait crisis?
Great, thanks, Mark. Honestly, across the board, as John alluded to, we're talking about something the likes of the Great Depression, and if this turns out to be a hot conflict, maybe even more akin to the economic collapse of World War II. When you look at some of the cascading second order effects that are on our risk map, which again you can check out on our website. The biggest thing, consumer goods are going to get hit really hard. China's been the major factory for many Western countries. Of course, over the last couple of years, a lot of firms with manufacturing in China have started to de-risk and started to nearshore and choose other places. But there's like a certain gap, like above, low skill and beneath the extremely high skill manufacturing in that middle tier that China has a near monopoly on. So a lot of companies overnight could potentially lose that. And the other thing we need to keep in mind is, China's the largest market in the world. So anyone selling products to China, instantly that could get turned off with sanctions and, reciprocal Chinese sanctions, or if the sea lanes get blocked off.
Thank you. Dale, what would a military conflict over Taiwan look like? Who would be the main players and what countries would be immediately impacted?
Yeah, I think there's two primary scenarios. One is just a blockade. It's not a hot war, if you will, or an invasion of the island. I think that China, to a certain degree, can achieve its goals by just blockading Taiwan, and all of the second, third order effects that would happen with that. Two, if Xi thinks that the military is ready, if he thinks the West is bogged down in the Middle East or Ukraine or is stretched, those two factors could drive the attempt at just a full-on invasion. So I think those are the two primary, ways we look at conflict with Taiwan from mainland China. I think the obvious question on who would be affected, going back to that map that Zev had, is it is the world. But make no mistake, the Philippines, Japan, Thailand, Cambodia, India, that whole part of the Red Sea and extension from that would immediately feel the brunt of this, with sea lane closures, airspace closures, lots of disruption, and then it would just become a global from there.
Hey, Mark, if I could point out, there's a couple of really good questions in the Q&A box, particularly the first one. Can you go to that?
I was just going to ask that one, John. So if China's become an economic center of gravity, why would they jeopardize that standing by blockading or invading Taiwan, especially if economics is a key component of achieving Marxist-Leninist ideals in China? Don't you think they see what the world's private sector did to Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine and took note?
Can I take a whack at that one?
Absolutely.
Well, anonymous, whoever you are, I would love to continue the conversation, point one. But quite simply, there's two elements to it. One is there's a strong belief in some circles, but not all circles in the PRC, that in the face of the economic consequences, the West would blink, and that whatever economic sanctions we in the US might move to impose, we would not be able to hold a coalition together. And so the economic consequences would not be as deep, and China would be able to take the pain because they believe that their society has more capacity to take pain than ours does, particularly in the short term. And then secondly, but perhaps even more importantly, what we saw in Russia and what we're seeing generally is that ideology is triumphing over economics, particularly in these geopolitical decisions. And the gains to China, excuse me, if China can break through the inner island chain and isolate Taiwan and unify it, it disrupts the entire region all the way out to Guam and calls into question the entire concept of the US security umbrella. And so then our main partners in the region, Japan, North Korea, or South Korea, have a choice to make, which is, do they fall in line with China, which is unlikely, or do they arm to the teeth? And both Japan and South Korea would likely go nuclear. But to China, the benefits of eliminating the US all the way past the Philippines are the big prize in the long run. And if it requires some economic pain in the short term, particularly if it shows that the US security guarantee cannot be trusted, that calculus works for them.
And Mark, if I could, just from a duty of care standpoint, when Russia was ramping up to go into Ukraine, we brought in all the experts. We brought in all the CI station chiefs, State Department people, and we estimated, based on those interactions, over 90% said they would not go. We countered and said, we need to plan, and we do think there's a 65% chance that this is going to turn into a hot war. When you look at the attacks in Israel, no one saw that coming. When you think about 9/11, the entire intelligence community got it wrong. When you look at Afghanistan and how poor the exit has been executed, my version of this is, one, why do we keep getting surprised? Because conventional minded thinking is crushing us. This lack of imagination is not good. And from a corporate standpoint, if you're prepared for the worst case and it happens and you have a great outcome because you were ready, it's all upside. But if you dismiss this and you don't have the imagination that this is real and a real threat, and you're not prepared, and then you fail materially, you think about BP in Russia leaving almost $30 billion worth of assets in the country and walking away. It doesn't make a lot of sense, ultimately, not to plan for this. I'll pause there.
Dale, just a little bit more kind of on that subject. If you have a firm that conducts a lot of travel to China, at what point should the firm be reconsidering sending employees to China? And what are the main risk factors associated with travel there?
So number one, we're doing a lot of open web and dark web searches on the people going. No one should be going, an expat should not be going to China. If they have an intelligence background, a military background, or they've been online, or they're on interviews, or they're posturing against what's happening in China and the region and their policies and their government and what's possible with Taiwan. Number two, you have to have a plan for detention. We're now on the 13th large Western corporate where executives are being detained for upward of 7 months. Detainment is the equivalent of being arrested for all intents and purposes. Do you have a real plan if that occurs, and how you're going to manage through that? Because it's now happening, month in and month out. And ultimately, thinking about your exposure of those personnel, who's going there next year or the year after, and thinking through, is that person absolutely the only person that can fill that billet, and should their family go with them, or should we really start to change these rotations on mainland China or Taiwan? Those are the things that we're seeing, the big three, as we think about people traveling to China right now.
Thank you. And then, John, how are your clients engaged in decoupling and managing potential Chinese retaliation and blowback?
Mark, step one is what they're trying to do is, don't raise the question until you've secured where you're going to be, how you're going to do it. But basically, lesson number one is blame it on the US government. And that may or may not be credible, but it's really an objective reality now that, particularly if you look at the Chinese information security laws, the EU information security laws, and the US information security laws, for all practical purposes, it is impossible to be in compliance with all three blocks laws concurrently today. So every company that's on this call, if they drilled in really deep, there would be some evidence or some incidents of non-compliance with some regulatory scheme. And so you have to pick one or more that you're going to have to reduce the exposure to in order to get back into compliance with the more important ones. So what you're seeing is, and that's part of the reason for some of this ring fencing that you're seeing going on. So you saw Morgan Stanley withdraw 200 analysts, research analysts from the PRC because they simply said, look, we can't do that job there legally under your laws, and we don't want our people to go to jail, so we'll bring them back. And we can't do, they can't do their job under EU laws. So I think the best thing to do is to point out the conflict of law problem. Now, the Chinese have acknowledged this and have spoken about addressing it, but for the time being, nothing concrete has been done. So that's the best point of departure for this, which is the conflict of laws problem.
Thank you, John. We're going to go a couple more minutes with at least one more question here, and this is directed at Zev. Can you talk a little bit about what are the main assumptions underlying the Taiwan Shock Index?
Sure thing, Mark. Shannon, you think it'd be possible to pull up the map? Might make it a little bit easier for the audience here. But essentially, main assumption here is that seaborne trade leaving East Asia would be severely constricted. I think it's around 70 or 80% of like the world's largest container ships go through that Taiwan Strait. It's how everything from East Asia gets to Africa and Europe. So that gets constricted. There'd be economic sanctions targeting China by the US and some, not necessarily all of its partners, making it a lot harder for foreign businesses to do business there. In turn, reciprocal sanctions, so that, essentially Western companies would not be able to do business in China and vice versa. The other thing is that all bilateral trade would be impacted emanating from the Taiwan Strait. So that's trade from other parts of East Asia to include South Korea and Japan as well. So that would be impacted and constricted. And then that China's willingness or ability to provide foreign direct investment would also be constrained. And finally, the other big assumption here is that China's willingness or ability to provide regime stabilizing support to other countries in the form of telecom information system management, arms, high profile infrastructure projects, and the likes of that would be severely diminished from a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So those are the assumptions underlying how this map ended up being so red.
Thank you, Zach. Dale? Excuse me, John, did you say something? Okay. Dale, I'll save the last question for you. What are the strategic, military, and economic takeaways China has derived from the conflict in Ukraine, and how might they be applied to a future conflict with Taiwan?
Yeah, I think militarily, obviously, the United States military arsenal is now strained and will continue to be. It's a factor in their calculus of when and where and how they might strike. And I'm sure they're watching very closely what's happening in the Middle East, and they are responding in kind. To John's point, I also think that there is an element of they're watching to see if the U.S. quote unquote blinks. I do think that's part of this calculus also, and it's a material, decision point for them in all of this if there were to execute a blockade or even create a hot war and an invasion. So I think all of those things are top of mind. And of course, what Zev led with is just the height of their society and their economic power and seeing how their military develops. Those are all key factors that we're watching as part of our triggers. And I think for the audience, these are all things that should be top of mind as you calculate your strategy on travel to China, you calculate your strategy on outsourcing to China, supply chain to China, and what people you have on the ground, why and how. Thank you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Dale. That was our last question, and this is the conclusion of today's webinar. You'll receive follow-up emails, including links to the video recording and briefing slides. And I wanted to thank John, Zev, and Dale for your valuable insights, and we hope to see you all at our next webinar. Thank you.